Hey guys, welcome back to Total Tactics FPL. It's Fran here, and I'm back with my Game Week 9 wildcard draft. This is just a draft to people who are looking to go for a Game Week 9 wildcard and looking to play around with the team in the international break and hopefully create a side that will last us towards that World Cup wildcard. That's why it's so important now to think about what your plans are in the short term in terms of maybe captaincies, players you want to bank on in the short term, but also the overall structure of your draft should really last you towards game week 16. So you can't just play immediately in the short term. You have to think about what the impacts of certain players are on your teams going forwards. So it's really important now to look at the wider fixture run as opposed to 2 to 3 game weeks at one time if you're wildcarding. I personally have gone for a game week 8 wildcard. You can follow my team selection there. I did make a review with my transfer plans. You can see that in the card up below. But for the game week 9 wildcard, let's actually start with the defense. With the keeper, I actually think Raya is the best pick. A lot of people will be suggesting Guaita, but one of the issues that I have with Guaita is he's not really suffering that many shots on target. And when you compare Crystal Palace and Brentford, they have similar scores when it comes down to expected goals conceded. And keep in mind, though, that Crystal Palace have actually played in a game less than Brentford. Brentford have been a little bit more open when it comes to the defense this season, but they have also improved as a defensive team. However, Raya has faced a lot of shots on target, and he's also made a hilarious amount of saves. And whilst I think Crystal Palace might actually end up with a bit more clean sheets, I think there's a bit more consistency to come from Raya, who's a very, very good shot stopper. If you're watching the Arsenal game, even though they got decimated, I do think Raya made some fantastic saves, even making 2 great saves versus Jesus, where Jesus realistically could have gotten a hat-trick in that game because he was putting some great shots and creating some great efforts. I just think that Arsenal team are really at a different level this season, and we have to just respect that. Whereas if you look at Brentford's fixture run going towards game week 16, for me, it's really just as good as Crystal Palace's. And I just like the fact that you have a bit more consistency there with Raya getting more shots, but not necessarily having worse statistics when it comes down to overall goals conceded from an expected point of view. Iverson is going to be my keeper suggested at 3.9. That's just to save you a little bit bang for your buck. Hopefully, if you have the money to spend towards even a Begovic punt, you could do that, especially if you're going for Guaita as a keeper. But I think Iverson's great here because he potentially could usurp Ward as a starting keeper. And worst case scenario, he's just a 3.9 keeper that allows you to save 0.1 in the bank. James and Trippier, for me, are people that are absolute locks on the defensive point of views because Trippier provides so much from the offensive through the free kicks, through the open play involvements that he hopefully will get as the season progresses. Newcastle haven't been the most dynamic team on the ball, I would say, this year. And Trippier impressed quite a bit in the preseason with some great crosses and open play, but we haven't seen that yet. But I just think that edge with him being such a lethal set piece taker is something that definitely should not be missed, given that Newcastle have such a great run of games. And it also offers you a perfect hedge towards people who went for a Game Week 8 wildcard and went double Newcastle defense, or people who've just simply went into Trippier in recent weeks by going out of Trent. As far as James, we know exactly what he is as an asset, whether he plays right back or right wing back. If you were watching the game versus Salzburg, he effectively played in a back five once again, with Sterling almost occupying that Trossard role, whereas James was the right wing back in that system, and he was still providing a lot of attacking threat. I just think James is so well valued at 6.0 that because he's nailed too in this Chelsea team, he just offers so much value. I would even suggest that maybe Cucurella could be an option too, but because I'm not sure exactly where Cucurella will play, whether he continues to play left centre back, which means he sort of has less value there, and maybe Fofana becomes more interesting, I would not really necessarily go into Cucurella at this point in time because we haven't gotten that extra game with Potter in the Premier League to understand what his second or what his actual default lineup will be in the Premier League. As far as the Trent role, yes, a lot of people are going to be rolling their eyes now because the key player I would say this season has been Cancelo really, and that's because he's playing in the City team that are so defensively well oiled. And you can see that from the underlying statistics. Whereas a team like Liverpool have shown us so many defensive collapses and have just generally looked much worse on paper, whether it's controlling the ball or just allowing so many easy counter attacks and not really putting pressure on defenders to actually keep their clean sheets. And Trent obviously has been someone guilty of that himself. However, Trent still is one of the best players in the league when it comes to expected goal involvements. Neco Williams is very close, but when you watch Neco Williams, you can easily see that he's a very erratic player, whereas Trent clearly is, I would say, the real deal when it comes to the offensive point of view. However, the reason why I've suggested Trent is simply because of that Game Week 12 blank. I wouldn't have ever gone Trent over Cancelo otherwise, but I do think there's an opportunity here if you're a Game Week 9 wildcarder to capitalize on Cancelo missing on Game Week 12. And because Cancelo's fixtures are still very, very tough in this run heading up to Game Week 13, I think it might make sense to actually go Trent over Cancelo for the time being, and then actually shift back into Cancelo after that blank game week, or even change out of one of the midfielders or the forwards if they've been unimpressive. Trent has a great game week 9 fixture with Brighton, and overall, I just think that going for one Liverpool defender is going to be quite a big differential for the next few weeks, even though Arsenal and City are bound to be extremely tough games. As I mentioned before, Fofana's minutes aren't nailed, so the best replacement is going to be someone like a Guehi from Crystal Palace or someone like Johnny from Wolves at 4.4. The reason why you want to move into these options is because their minutes are probably more nailed, and because, simply put, Wolves and Crystal Palace have really good fixtures up until Game Week 16 because they've already played some of the toughest opponents the league's had to offer. What I would say about Guehi, of course, is you are relying on a centre-back who is a pretty much set-piece threat only, whereas Johnny is someone who might be a little bit more interesting in open play. Ultimately, though, you're only relying on them or one or two key fixtures, such as Game Week 12, especially if you load up on some Arsenal and City assets. I would only really recommend to go for 3 assets for this time being, because there's such a short time between now and Game Week 12. As far as the last position in this team, it does belong to James Justin. And James Justin is interesting because Leicester have a great run of games. You can see a sea of green in the near future for James. And I just liked how offensive he was in the Tottenham game. Someone who's nailed in that Leicester team who can hopefully do much better in a sea of green fixtures. And someone who's already providing offensive threat when he drew the penalty versus Tottenham. So I just think James Justin is a great asset to have, especially if, let's say, Iverson is not going to play consistently for Leicester. You could even have coverage of that Leicester defense if you so choose. If we move on to the midfield now, I think these players are all at a lock. Andreas is here because he's going to be nailed, and Bailey still possesses the same issue where I don't think his minutes are guaranteed. He only played 66 minutes for Southampton, and there is a risk, of course, that he might not start the next game. There is enough bench depth in Aston Villa and enough quality that I think Gerrard has a little bit more faith over at times that Bailey could see himself on the bench, whereas someone like Andreas is nailed to play at least 75 to 80 minutes per game as a starter. So that's the main difference there. And even though Willian has come into the team and effectively nerfed Andreas's potential and his ceiling as an asset, I just think the permanency of minutes and having a solid bench option that can be relied upon is actually very important. Maddison and Zaha, for me, are non-negotiables on this draft. And the reason why is because Maddison just simply has a great run of games. And if you were watching the Spurs versus Leicester game, you would have seen how good he was, even in a 6-2 defeat. I thought he really could have had a 1 goal, 1 assist game, and he was deserving of one. He created a lot of opportunities for someone like Patson Daka, and just showed some great positioning when he actually found himself one-on-one with Lloris making a great feet save. And with Zaha, you have someone who just has a great run of games. Even though he has Chelsea, you absolutely should be slamming him in your wildcard draft. Because the whole point of the wildcard is that you make sure you have your players that can last you for the next 7 to 8 game weeks and even potentially beyond. Zaha is someone who just has a great run of games. He's on penalties, and he's the clear talisman for this Crystal Palace side. So there's absolutely no other asset that I would choose over Zaha for the time being, really, in the midfield. I think he's the absolute best option for now. Martinelli is someone that I've chosen to keep, and that's simply because I decided to go with a Trent version of this draft. If you do opt to go for Cancelo, I can completely understand wanting to drop Martinelli. However, I also understand that a lot of managers are incredibly reluctant to let go of someone like Martinelli and the built-in value that they have created with Martinelli, because even though he has a blank, you should hopefully have a wildcard draft that covers him well in Game Week 12, and going forwards, Martinelli just provides so much value, or arguably too much value, really, as an option at 6.6, which is his current price as an Arsenal asset. And I think that's the value that Martinelli has over someone like a Saka and even a Jesus going forwards. We might even find ourselves moving towards these options, such as a Saka and such as a Jesus and even a Saliba as well in the near future. But for now, I think Martinelli is someone who's a little bit interesting for most FPL managers, because most in-tune managers would have already built up a lot of value in him, and I can understand not wanting to drop him. So that's kind of why I've kept him in this draft here. Not to mention, he also has a great game versus Leeds, and you probably also still want to start him versus Tottenham. With Salah, the reason why he enters his team, and I can already understand a lot of groans around the world watching this video, not thinking about options like De Bruyne, even Sterling or Son. But the reason why Salah for me is the best option heading in towards Game Week 17 for the World Cup is because he just provides you the best captaincy in Game Week 12, and you don't really want to work your way towards transfers there, because I think Salah has shown, at least in the last year, even with his arguably poorer form than usual, that he is very, very good at collecting results and actually doing well versus some of the top teams. And that's exactly what he's going to be up against in Game Weeks 10 and Game Weeks 11 versus Arsenal and City. With the Brighton game, I also think he possesses a great chance of being a slightly better haul option than KDB, then Son, then Kane as well, and even Sterling potentially. And that's exactly why Salah enters this draft. I think he's not going to be your set and forget captaincy. It's going to be clearly Haaland. But for 12, you're looking for a captain that replaces Haaland. And effectively, I think Salah does that role perfectly well. And that's exactly why he's going to sit in your draft. Because following that West Ham game, he's going to have Nottingham Forest and Leeds, which is exactly why you still want to have Salah in your team. And I think there's enough value in some of the other players that we've built in this draft, such as a Zaha, such as a Madison, who are cheaper than most of the 8.0 options and beyond, that we can create a draft finally with Salah that makes sense. And especially with some of the incoming price drops that you'll have over the wildcard window with Trent and Salah, you can easily afford a team like this, and potentially even a stronger one if you have more money in the bank. Moving on to the forwards, I really think this is absolutely set and forget. Mitrovic, Haaland, Tony are going to be my 3 top picks. I think the first question people will be asking is why not go for someone like Alexander Isak? And frankly, I think Isak is someone who is going to be, one, affected by Callum Wilson. A lot of people have talked about his positioning and how that would be affected when Callum Wilson comes in. I do think Isak could actually be shoved onto the wings. But the most important thing in seeing why Isak was such a great pick for the Bournemouth game is that he was that penalty taker. Without the penalty, Isak really had a frankly poor game versus Bournemouth, a team that most people have expected an exceedingly good haul over. And I would say Isak did fail to live up to people's expectations. And as I've mentioned time and time again, as someone who's been watching Isak and his development in La Liga under La Real, is that Isak is someone who's a little bit more inconsistent, but clearly is a big game player. If you've been watching him for Sweden, you can see he's got some intangibles as a player, and he's got a lot of potential, but you're looking at him to be consistent for you in your team in the season. And I think Tony has been the absolute beacon of consistency this year. Even in an Arsenal game where Brentford really had no chances whatsoever, Tony still came the absolute closest with a free kick direct opportunity. And I just think that Tony being on free kicks, being on penalties, and showing that he actually has the quality to hit some fantastic free kicks, and showed such a wide variety of strikes in the Leeds game where he actually got his beautiful hat-trick, for me just sets him apart from some of the other options like an Isak. And for Mitrovic as well, I mean, we saw very, very similar things, with exception to a direct free kick from him so far. In a sea of tough fixtures, he pretty much, I would say, stuck out as one of the best options in the game, and he still is ridiculously underpriced. I think arguably that's what we've said for most of the forwards this season, as we look at someone like Haaland, who's much cheaper than Salah as well, but clearly the default captaincy option. And that's kind of the position that we've arrived at with FPL. With Mitrovic, yes, he had a blank last week, but I really can't see him being a worse option than someone like a Solanke. I really don't see how Bournemouth are going to consistently create chances. Solanke clearly doesn't have the chances fall upon him. And Mitrovic had a little bit of an off game, I suppose, versus Nottingham Forest, but still was finding opportunities to crack good shots and create good opportunities for himself. And I really just think that going forwards, this Fulham team is going to continue building chances for him. And the numbers really statistically have backed that up. So I really think Mitrovic is going to be a nailed option there. And Haaland, of course, the less said, the easier. The way this team is actually going to set out for your Game Week 9 wildcard is exactly how it looks. It's going to be a 3-4-3 setup. You're going to be playing Raya, James, Trippier, probably Cancelo, as I guess a lot of managers will fear going to Trent for now, especially doubling up on Liverpool when they haven't really shown us that much. And then going for Salah, Martinelli, Zaha, and Madison to start. Martinelli still is a great fixture to play versus Tottenham in the North London derby. I thought Tottenham actually looked incredibly wide open in the previous match, so I do think Martinelli deserves to start. And then Mitrovic, Haaland, and Tony are your best options, with obviously the captaincy slammed on Haaland, because I really don't think there's any reason to mess around with that. He's just shown too much consistency versus all sorts of teams that you can't really go wrong with Haaland unless there's an international break injury. But that's going to be my wildcard draft suggested for Game Week 9. I hope you guys have a wonderful week ahead, and I'll see you guys very shortly.